couple different reasons. There weren't really too many surprises in terms of the college football playoff round one this week. I mean, really, the results that happened were results that we thought would happen. I mean, Penn State beat SMU, Notre Dame whooped Indiana, and then Ohio State took care of business versus Tennessee. So I mean, in that regard, and then Texas beat Clemson too. But when you're looking at this on paper, I mean, you really kind of say to yourself, hey, the results that were there were the results that we sort of anticipated. And I guess the conversation kind of comes now into what are the general takeaways from these college football playoffs. And I think in many ways one of the drawbacks on the playoff in general is that you're just going to have people who over sensationalize every little thing. Like for example, talking about Curb Herbstreit's commentary, for example, regarding the Ohio State game. You could talk about that. You could talk about people complaining about blowouts in college football, for example, which I don't think is going to change anytime soon. I'd say that's one of the big takeaways I got from this college football playoff is it doesn't matter whether you have 2 teams in the playoff, 4 teams in the playoff, 8 teams in the playoffs, 12 or 16. The reality is that there's always going to be programs. There's always going to be powerhouse programs that are in college football, whether you like it or not. And having a playoff isn't necessarily going to resolve that overnight too. I mean, stat that I had below, 22 out of the 34 playoff games have been results where teams have won by 14 points or more. And you can even go back and let's go back down memory lane here. I mean, I think of the Michigan-Washington game. I think of the 2022 national title game with Georgia and TCU. That game ended up being 65-7. You go back in 2014 and you say number 2 Oregon beat Florida State 59-20. So like no matter what time period you're talking about, there's always going to be blowouts in college football. And now the narrative is going to be, well, maybe the committee screwed it up somehow, which 2 weeks ago nobody was saying that because they did get it right. So it's kind of the catch-22 and also just kind of the hypocrisy of some college football fans and analysts out there who will say it's good in the moment and then all of a sudden you see the games and it's no big deal. But hindsight's always 20/20 at the end of the day. And when you look at the games out on the field, I mean, obviously you could tell I think the most obvious evident part was the Notre Dame-Indiana game where you can just tell Notre Dame is just a much more talented team than Indiana, which I guess was kind of ironic, hearing Kirk Cignetti talk shit about how he's just, whooping teams and whatnot too. Then Notre Dame just comes out and just takes care of business and everything. But definitely a strong win for Notre Dame in general. But when you look at this too, at the end of the day, it's just part of the game is that there's going to be blowouts. Now, do I think it's necessarily a problem? I don't really think so. Like in my opinion, it's not really a matter of a problem. I think so, in terms of competitiveness, I guess you can argue that to a degree, but at the same time too, the games are played and the player and the teams that should be there were there. So if the result ends up being 28-24, so be it. If it ends up being 42-7, then so be it. Like whatever result it ends up being, that's just kind of how it is. And I don't know how exactly you change that necessarily. Because I mean, if you look back at past history, you've looked at, even going back to, when there wasn't even a national playoff at all. Back in the day, it was, hey, number one was the national champion. That was pretty much it. And then you had your bowl games here and there, and that was ultimately conclusion. Because the reality is, no matter how many teams are in it or who ends up getting in, you're always going to have people bitching, whining, and complaining no matter what. I mean, even at the end of the Ohio State Tennessee game, there were people talking about, oh, well, if Alabama or Ole Miss or South Carolina was in, then all of a sudden that these games would be more competitive. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, it's easy to sit there and say when something happens that, okay, maybe this is what should have happened instead. But who's to say that Notre Dame wouldn't have whooped Alabama, for example? I mean, if Oklahoma can whoop Alabama, what makes you think that Notre Dame can't? So it's just like when you hear things like that, I think it's just positive to kind of put things into perspective in terms of, not only or blowouts really aren't changing anytime soon. It's part of the game. But I don't really think it's that big of a deal. And I would just encourage people to kind of look at it from that lens too. Of at the end of the day, there's going to be close games. There's going to be blowout games, and it just kind of is what it is. So I mean, it's whatever. But I mean, now going on point number 2 here in terms of the big takeaways I got from this weekend. I loved seeing how enthusiastic the student section was for these games too, in terms of just the college football games being on campus. I think it's something that absolutely needs to stay. And I've talked about this on the show before, especially when you talk about one of the things I love about the difference in college ball versus the NFL is just how much of a difference it makes in terms of being at home. At the end of the day, being at home makes such a huge difference. And you saw that on display this weekend. I mean, even you watch the beginning of the Penn State SMU game, and for SMU to have multiple false starts, to see Kevin Jennings not be able to hear anything out of his helmet, it was definitely just incredible to see the fans, the enthusiasm, and it goes to show too that you need to be rewarded for having a higher seed at the end of the day. I mean, when you have home field advantage, it's important, and I think it helps for the integrity of the game too. Because at the end of the day, too, yes, everybody needs their share of the pie in terms of okay, ESPN has to make their money, the conferences have to make their money, the whatever, all that stuff needs to kind of mellow out. But at the same time, too, it is a football game, and at the same time, too, the fans, us who are supporting these programs, going through these games, it's important that they're being rewarded for that, which for me, in my perspective, rewarding would mean these games being played on campus at home programs. Because when you sit there and I love the tradition of the Fiesta Bowl, the Peach Bowl, the Rose Bowl, which by the way I've said before should be home to the college football national championship game every single year, but that's another subject. So regardless of which bowl you're talking about, you can't help but say to yourself just a total 180 in terms of the enthusiasm and the energy level at a neutral site such as A&TT Stadium or MedLife or whatever stadium you want to talk about. You just can't sit there and tell me you don't see the difference. You don't feel the difference between games being played in those stadiums versus on campus too. And I really hope moving forward, I know there's going to be tweaks in terms of maybe they're going to reseed some things, maybe they're going to add more teams, whatever it is. I mean, ultimately, I just hope that part of it really continues to stay, because I think the more you kind of have these neutral site games where you're just trying to sell out as many tickets as you can, I think it hurts the product in that way. And I think watching these games all shape out, especially even watching college game day, for example, watching Fox News, all those guys, really, you could feel the energy, you can feel the enthusiasm, and seeing the commentary team just get a lot more excited about certain plays. But even when Chris Fowler, when Will Howard hit that 30-yard touchdown pass to Jeremiah Smith in the first quarter, he had two of them actually, but particularly the first one, it was when he was like touchdown Buckeyes, and then everyone got all excited. So for that energy to come out of the field too, and at the same time too, it is a playoff game. There should be more energy. There should be more excitement, and for all of that to come out on display during the games, for me at least, as a fan and just somebody who was watching, I definitely think it's something that needs to stay, and it's something that just needs to be continued in college football. But I'd say the final takeaway that I have in terms of this game too is I think Ohio State probably is the team to beat in terms of whether it's Ohio State or Oregon. I mean, they should definitely be the top two teams right now. I've said before that Georgia would be the number three, which I'm very intrigued about the Georgia Notre Dame matchup. I think that's going to be a game I certainly have my eyes on, and I think it's going to be an intriguing matchup for a number of reasons. But when you look at it this weekend, I mean, obviously Notre Dame and Penn State did their thing, and I know people are going to not give them as much credit because, like, hey, SMU kind of walked in and threw a couple pick sixes, then Indiana couldn't get their offense going, and I get that to some degree too, and I know people are going to kind of take away from their victories because of that, and I'm not sitting there saying that, but all I'm getting at is from what I've seen right now, when you watch that Ohio State offense put up 21 points on their first three drives, you just sit there and say to yourself, out of all the teams that we watched this weekend, to me, that's the biggest threat that you see. Now, granted, Clemson made things a little bit interesting late in the Texas game, but I was certainly impressed with how efficient Texas was at running the football too. I mean, you sit there and a lot of questions were asked in terms of whether Quinn Ewers could be the guy to lead them to a national championship game, and quite frankly, he did just enough to get him through Clemson. So I'd say he's still going to be the guy and everything. But in terms of who should be favored moving forward, I mean, you got to imagine the matchup Ohio State and Oregon's going to be the matchup that ultimately all really talking about too, in the sense of a couple, when they played a couple months ago, that was the matchup that we were all talking about. That's the matchup that literally came down to 1 point, and for them to have an extra week to be able to prepare and do all those things too, I think that matchup's really going to be indicative of who should be favored going into the rest of the college football playoffs this year.